Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to read part of C.W. Hobley's book, Bantu Beliefs and Magic. And in this part, he's talking about the death sentence and how it was governed or how it was handled in the Agikuyu and the Akamba republics. Of course, when it comes to the death sentence, or the death sentence is a very, we can say, controversial aspect of we can say, the criminal law, and it has been for a very long time, and not just today, but even the societies that have gone by. It has always been very difficult to decide whether some people deserve to be basically their lives taken when they commit certain types of crimes. And today, of course, for example, Kenya, this used to be a part of the law that if you committed certain types of crime, then you'll be taken through a judicial process, and at the end of it, the judge will decide that you deserve to your life taken. In the US, many states still carry out this punishment. You can be taken through a judicial process, and the jury, they use juries there, could decide that the most fitting punishment is for your life to be taken. And we can say most societies have had this, but today many societies are deciding to abandon it. Kenya has technically abandoned it. The last person to be executed was in the 1980s, and while the sentence is still passed or is still given, it's not implemented. It's always assumed that if you are given that sentence, it becomes a life in prison. Now, in the Akikuyu Republic and the Akamba Republic, they did have this sentence or this punishment. And what you find to be very interesting when you start looking at how it was done, then you realize that these were very complex societies, at least when it came to this matter. Like, this is not a matter that was taken lightly. It was taken to be a very serious matter, and for them to decide, or that society to decide, that one needed to hit their life taken, it wasn't taken lightly. That's the impression I get by reading Hobley's book about this subject. Now, he discusses how this was done both in Akamba and the Akikuyu, and he starts with the Akamba and describes it, and then he goes to Agikuyu Republic. And this again proves to you that the Agikuyu was a republic, the Akamba was a republic, they were nations. Most African, the so-called tribes today, were actually commonwealths that had laws that governed almost every aspect of the lives of the people. Now, this is what he says. He says the Kinoli custom, that's what it was called in the Akamba. I would likely call it the Kinoli Penal Code or something of sort. He says the author's Ethnology of Akamba, page 95, an account is given of the old form of judicial execution called Kinoli, which used to be the customary throughout Ukamba. It is also referred to by C. Dundas in the history of Kitui. So he gives us two documents that discuss this, we can call it law or criminal law in the Akamba Republic. And he continues to say, it is not proposed to describe over again the detail of the procedure, but while considering the question of sacrifice, it may be interesting to point out the similarity of this practice with the judicial slaying which took place among the ancient Semites, e.g. among the Hebrews. The criminal was stoned. So he brings out, or he compares, or he shows, or he tries to tell us that the way the Akamba did it, to some extent, seems like is the way it is described in the Bible Testament, how it was done among the Semite groups, as he calls them. He says Professor R. Smith ably shows how the idea of an execution of this kind is not penal in one sense of the word. It is not done to punish the offender, but to rid the community of an impious member, generally a man who has shed the tribal blood. Now, this is a very important point, and this argument actually goes into arguments that are made in many courts around the world. I like watching court proceedings, and there is this question of when a person is either imprisoned or their life is taken, when they have been taken through a judicial process, is it about punishment or is it protecting society? Often the argument is it is both. You are protecting society, but at the same time you are punishing. But there are instances where it's not actually punishing the person, it's actually getting rid of that evil from society. And he says this is the view or this is the impression that one Professor R. Smith got when he was trying to study how the Akamba did it. The Akamba did not do it as a way to punish the person. And I would say this is the view of even most of, or many of modern societies, for example, the US. It mostly doesn't look like they do it to punish the person, because, and this is why when somebody is executed in most of these societies today, not ago, long time ago, or sometime in the past, there used to be the element of punishing, trying to make the person suffer the most pain possible. And if you are going to talk about that, then it looks like the Akamba were very far ahead in this way of thinking. In the US today, when their life is taken, they try to make them as comfortable as possible and try to make sure that they don't get to go through any pain. There should be as little discomfort as possible. And that tells you the goal is not to punish them, but even though it's punishing, the goal is actually to get rid of them. And this is the view of the Akamba. This is how they viewed it. It wasn't so much about punishing the person. It was so much, or it was to a large extent, about getting the evil out of society. And he continues to say, it will appear that the repeated spilling of tribal blood is an act which annoys the Aimu of the tribe to such an extent that the ordinary sacrifice is insufficient to appease them, and a human sacrifice becomes necessary either as an expiation or re-establish good relations. By not offering a compensation of the crime he has committed, the brothers of the criminal formally surrender him to the community, and this acquits the community of any blood stain. Now, there are a few things to say here, and I'm thinking likely he is wrong on some arguments, especially when he says human sacrifice. I don't think the most republics in East Africa and even monarchies, human sacrifice was something that was ever practiced. I've not come across any document that talks about that, or even any stories of the people themselves talking about the need for human sacrifice. So I don't think the Akamba did it for that reason. It wasn't for that reason. It was, as if, I think most likely it was just get rid of the evil that was considered to be the person they are looking at was representing, especially when they um, they um, maybe committed this crime several times. Maybe they did it once, and then there was rituals that were done to remove that, and then they do it again. Then at that point the society is like, no, maybe it's best for this person not to be among the society. And there is this concept of a monster, and I've talked about it in another video. The concept of a monster is very powerful. And a monster, of course, all of us, we know what a monster is. A monster is this thing that is not human, and it represent maybe the most evil you can think about. And as humans, we understand that some of us can become monsters. Now, even the person who has done things that qualify them to be called a monster, they hate to be called a monster. And there is a reason for that. Of course, there are a few who will be like, yeah, I'm the monster. But for the average person, the idea of being considered a monster is very scary. And there's a reason why it is scary. It is scary because you, by being viewed as a monster, you are basically removed from the human society. Now you are no longer part of the human society. And one of the biggest fears we have as humans is not to belong to the unity of society, family and clan and bigger society. So when people say you are a monster, basically now they remove you from society. They stop considering you as a human. And that's a very dangerous, lonely place to find yourself. So most likely society will come to this to remove a monster from society. So he says in the Akamba that, of course, there is a place in the book where he talks about compensation, the blood compensation, blood money as it's called. And when somebody took a life of another, they were expected to pay. And he does go into detail, especially among the Akamba, as to how many animals one was expected to pay when that happened and in what situations. But then it seems like he's suggesting in this case, when it was decided that this person needed to be removed from society completely, then there was no payment that was needed to be made. They were just taken. And I think that's why he came to the conclusion that it was a sacrifice. But I don't see how you can run into the conclusion of it being a sacrifice, while in the others, the central thing was payment. Even though there were sacrifices in sheep and goat, but the central component to that resolution was usually payment. Now there's no payment here, so I don't think we should say like because there's no payment then this becomes sacrifice. Obviously, or I'm thinking, even when there were no payments made after this person's life had been taken, there must have been some actual sacrifice of goats and sheep to just maybe lay their spirit completely to leave society for good. Now he comes to explaining the same concept in the Akikuyu Republic, and he says the King'oli custom is also known among the Kikuyu, who call it Muinge. The the Honorable C. Dunda states that the procedure in Kikuyu is practically the same as that in Ukamba, except that the near relative of the accused, whose consent to the execution is essential, had to carry it out by strangling the convicted person. Now, this is very interesting in that they needed a near relative of the accused to give permission or to consent to that sentence being carried out. That is something that does not happen in any other legal system I can think of. Of course, in some modern jurisdictions, the relatives of the victim can be or can come in and say, no, we forgive them and don't take their life. But having a relative of the perpetrator provide consent, these are very interesting, or these are very not common way that maybe it's common in the old societies, or it was, but it's the first time I'm seeing that. So he says that the relative of the perpetrator will provide the consent, but at the same time, it was the relatives of the perpetrator, this in the Kikuyu, who will actually carry out the sentence. While in the Akamba, it seems to suggest that the perpetrator was stoned, meaning by many people, and he says it's similar to how it was done in the Semite societies of the ancient, of course, the Hebrews and others. And so he says, but in among the Akikuyu, the relative of the perpetrator will do the task. Another important point is that any person giving evidence against a tribesman being tried under this law had to make his charges on the Kithito or Kithati, which is one of the most potent oaths. Now, this is interesting. You see, for somebody to be sentenced to death, it's a very serious sentence because it cannot be reversed. Once done is done. And I think all societies that use this, or many of them, of course, not all of them, there are those that are a little bit careless. And it is both in the West, in Africa, in Asia. There are those that have been a little bit careless. We can talk of the Soviet Union. People were just, killed right, left, and center without much care. Or maybe we can talk of North Korea or some other, or the Khmer Rouge. But there are societies that are more established in their legal systems. Then there is an understanding that this is a very serious matter and this is a serious sentence. And before it is passed and implemented, there must be a lot of care taken. In the US, for example, where they still carry out death sentences, of course, you can see this element of being very, very careful, where the person who has been sentenced, the process has to be reviewed and looked at, and before it is done, they want to be very sure that actually this person needed to go through that process. Even though, of course, mistakes happen. There have been cases throughout history where somebody, their life is taken, and then later on, several years down the road, is realized, oh, maybe they were not supposed to be, they were innocent actually. So, but among the Akikuyu, how they tried to avoid that mistake of having an innocent person facing a death sentence is to make sure that everybody who gave evidence against him would be taken through an oath-taking process, and although they will take an oath called Kithito, which was one of the most potent oaths. And in these societies, oaths were very, very powerful. People understood or believed that if you take an oath and then you go against the oath, sometimes it meant your life, you are putting your life at risk. So the Akikuyu used to make those who are going to testify take this oath, so that they make sure that the evidence that is going to be used to judge and sentence this person is evidence that is legit, genuine, and is not cooked, and is not driven by malice and things like that. And this is very interesting. When you read these things, then you come to the conclusion that African republics were actually very well organized, very, very well organized. Most of them, the protocols took care of every critical component, and they took care of everything that needed to be taken care of, even when things went wrong. And these are some of the details that are often lost when we are talking about African societies before the arrival of the colonial powers. Yeah, we don't talk about how, for example, the death sentence was arrived at and how it was implemented and things like that, and the considerations. When you start looking at that and then you look at how it is done today, and even in the societies that we claim to be the most advanced in their organization, then you realize the African republics were not any different. They were very advanced, very well organized, complex, and things like that. Those are my random thoughts.